hardware folks? All right, one. We'll convert you.
How about a little bit hungover? How many? Wow. Those guys aren't awake yet, I guess. So Frank, why don't we start by just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and about Open Compute and why Facebook kicked it off.
Okay. Well, I actually joined Facebook in 2009 when they were considering building their own data centers and building their own server and storage devices. And actually, I moved from Austin to San Francisco for that role. Prior to that, I was with Dell for 14 years, so kind of grew up in the x86 server business. So yeah, never would have thought that I'd go from kind of growing up in the hardware business to joining a web startup. But it's been a great experience, and I think the reason Facebook was thinking about building their own stuff was at the rate that we were growing at the time, it was just cost prohibitive, and really the environmental impact of renting our data center space and buying off-the-shelf server and storage devices was just too much to overcome. Because we obviously run a free service, we obviously are making some money now, but scaling cost effectively and environmentally sensitively, if there is such a word, was really important to us. So that's why we went and did what we did. We put our first data center into production up in Prineville, Oregon. We selected that site because we use 100% outside air, so we don't use any air conditioning in the data center facility. We also designed a pretty unique electrical transformation solution that basically just steps down the utility power once before it gets to a custom power supply that we designed. We also don't use any room-wide UPS, so typically you pass electricity through UPS to charge the batteries, and you lose 5 or 6% efficiency through that. So we did a lot of really unique things in the design, and once we got it all into production and measured the results, we said, wow, like, wouldn't it be cool if we open source this? Like, what would happen if we actually applied the open source principles of the software world to the hardware world? If you look at the pace of innovation that's occurred in the software space relative to the pace of innovation that's occurred in hardware, it's night and day difference. And so we launched the Open Compute project in April of 2011, and we've now spun it out into a nonprofit foundation, and we're starting to see those benefits of accelerating the pace of innovation and lots of crowdsourcing initiatives around, hey, that's a good design, but we know how to make it better. So applying those principles of open source software to the hardware space has been pretty awesome.
Cool. And at Rackspace, we've been around since 1999, and we started a cloud business about 6 or 7 years ago. And last year, we run some of these big data centers that Frank was talking about, and we started thinking about the software that we were having to build for our cloud offerings. And we had customers who were coming to us and asking us, can we get that same software from you? We were looking at our processes of how we developed it internally, and we kind of came to a similar conclusion that what we should really do is open source this software. There wasn't a real open source solution out there for powering large-scale computing and storage environments. Started the process of doing that in early 2010, and ended up connecting with a group at the Ames Research Center in California. It's a NASA facility, and they were doing something similar, and we combined, and in the summer of 2010, we launched OpenStack with NASA and about 20 other companies, and it's grown. It's been huge. There are about 155 companies involved now. We have thousands of community members who write code, who write documentation, do testing. It's been deployed all over the world. It's obviously running at Rackspace. It's running at startups. It's running at big telcos like AT&T, and it's been a kind of a crazy ride to go from a very small project to something that's large. Frank mentioned that Open Compute has spun off a nonprofit foundation. We're actually in the process of doing that for OpenStack as well, and it's kind of an interesting thing to go through because rather than doing it at the beginning, we have this community and this software process and everything in flight, and now we're kind of trying to overhaul how it's managed and run. So that's created a lot of interesting things for us to work through and plan out with the community. But I think we have a bunch of topics that we can sit here and talk through. But we want to know why you guys are here this morning and what you'd like to hear about. We can talk about starting open source projects inside of big companies. We can talk about the governance and the processes that we've seen work or not work. We can talk about funding these kinds of things, getting partnerships with commercial companies. Is there anything that stands out that anybody would like to hear about, or a direction that you'd like us to go? Yes?
Okay. Some kind of program that.
Okay.
So one of the challenges that both of your projects have had is you're building this project, you're trying to deliver a service, and you're also trying to encourage contributions and trying to build a community at the same time.
Yep.
So, and I know that for both of you, there's a danger of kind of sucking all the air out of the room because you have the core developers. And so what kind of efforts, I know you're both starting foundations or have started foundations, and that's a really good first step. But how do you actually reach out and still service, the part of the business you need to service?
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's a great question, and it's a really good question because it's a little bit different for both projects here. With OpenStack, when we were getting this started, one of the things that we said is, if we put this out there and no one else contributes to it or uses it, then that's a total failure because it's a lot of effort to open source something and run it in an open way. And if we're not getting anybody else on board with it, then that's just a lot of waste. So we actually spent a lot of time thinking about, what has made other open source projects successful? What are things that we should do the same? What are things that we should do differently? And one of the things that we did from the very beginning is we actually, and this was a benefit of having, like you said, a Rackspace or a big company that was leading it. From the very beginning, we went out to partners that we had and to other companies and did kind of business development with them and got them on board, at least conceptually, from the beginning to say, well, this is a good idea and it's a good direction. And then over time we work on them and say, hey, have you guys thought about contributing? Do you have any developers that can work on it? And did a lot of business development, relationship type things. That's something that I think if you look at historically the way that open source projects develop, it's not generally something that they do, but it's proven to be pretty effective. And one of the things that's been really excellent about it is within a year we had over 100 developers that were being paid full time by various companies to work on OpenStack. And when you have professional developers who spend their day job coding on a project, that's when it can really start to advance. The other thing that we've done that again we've done a lot earlier than most open source projects is marketing. And it's one of those things where a lot of open source communities are very developer centric, and developers don't always see the value of marketing. But in OpenStack, I think we've tried to do marketing in a way that is very developer friendly and business friendly. We do a lot of events. We do a lot of developer activities. We try to include our developers in the things that we do, whether it's getting them speaking engagements or putting them on video or whatever it is. And that has helped to create a lot of interest and buzz around OpenStack and contributed to the growth of it as well. And from the very beginning, like I said, we've just tried to make sure that we are pulling in people as much as we can. We also made some decisions in how it's structured and licensed. Our software is Apache 2 licensed, which is basically very permissive license. Companies everywhere are familiar with it and comfortable with it because it's very business friendly. You can take the code and you can commercialize it and you can change it, and there's no kind of provision where you have to contribute your modifications back to the main source tree. So it means as a company you can feel very comfortable using the code. It means as a community we have to do a lot to encourage people to go ahead and contribute back where they can. And so far, we've seen a lot of success with that. You talked about employing the core developers. When we started, we were doing 100% of the code contributions, and I think now that's down more like 60 or 65%. So we still do a lot of the code contributions, but it's in less than a year and a half. There's already a massive body of work that's coming in from outside. What about you guys? I know it's a little different in the hardware world, and especially I think working with some of the companies in the hardware world.
And also, you can talk about the licensing questions that you had to figure out.
Yeah, okay. In the hardware world, it is a lot different, and that's probably one of the reasons why we moved so quickly to spinning this out into a foundation. Because clearly, as I mentioned, Facebook was the initiator of the project, and we came up with these really leading-edge designs for scale computing. But we quickly set a goal to say, like, it shouldn't be 100% Facebook all the time, because we may not, obviously we've got about a dozen really great engineers, but that's far from having all the greatest engineering minds on this project. And so we're already getting pretty close to 50% of the contributions from outside of Facebook in a very short period of time. And I think the reason for that is because there's a lot of grassroots effort coming from consumers of IT. So these consumers are saying, we want a really efficient infrastructure, more like what Facebook and the Open Compute Project are proposing. How do we get it? And so they're asking their suppliers for open compute technology. Those suppliers are now turning around saying, oh, well, I guess we should be involved in this. I don't know yet how I'm going to make a business out of selling open source hardware, but I'm going to figure it out, right? And so I think that's why the contributions have been coming so quickly on the Open Compute Project. It's just because people look at kind of what they've been doing in the mainstream IT deployment space and what they could be doing if they could think differently about their infrastructure. And then they're asking their suppliers for things that look differently, and so the suppliers are then contributing. And then one of the opportunities that comes out of that, I think, is for a lot of the emerging suppliers, right? So think about suppliers that in the hardware space have traditionally been in the contract manufacturing business, for example. They're not used to working with end users. They're used to making maybe 1 or 2 points of gross margin. And now they have the ability to present to an end user a customizable infrastructure, right? Where they say, tell me about your problem first before I present you my roadmap, which has always been kind of frustrating for me as a consumer. Is, how do you come and write a prescription before you ask me what's wrong with me? So I think one of the side benefits of openness is the ability for consumers to actually describe their problem statement, so that the contributors to the project can come up with unique ways to solve the problem using open compute building blocks and then putting it into a solution that works. And so it's creating a lot of opportunity, I think, for a whole slew of new suppliers, right? Suppliers like Synex, you look at ODMs like Quanta, for example, who are now approaching end users. Small players like ZT Systems that are actually approaching this hardware infrastructure space more as a services business, as opposed to, let me sell you some different, slightly differentiated hardware at a premium. They'd rather say, let me tell you about my engineering services where I can modify this hardware design for you. Let me tell you more about how I can validate how OpenStack runs on Open Compute hardware and how I'll provide post-sale support for that infrastructure. And let me show you what the ongoing operating cost impact of being able to put all this together in a really highly efficient solution looks like. So I think that's creating a lot of the contribution flow, and it is also leading to adoption of the technology as well. So I'm not sure if that answered all of your question or not.
Yeah, I got much more questions.
Okay, cool.
There was somebody else.
I just had a question about the governance. You mentioned
Yes.
governance and going, but just follow up on the prior question about, do you see changes in business models coming from your partners as a result of doing this? So there's that kind of effect of by setting the kind of foundation.
Yeah, I do see
that way.
like I mentioned, I think the companies that are really thinking about how to build a business around open source hardware are really thinking about this first and foremost as a services business, right? Andy Beckelsheim, who's on the board of directors with me, he coined the term gratuitous differentiation. And gratuitous differentiation, and I was guilty of it during my years when I was growing up in the hardware space. You're always trying to figure out what widgets can I add to this machine that make it slightly different from the next guy's machine.
Is that why there's like 4 SD card slots on the front of some of those desktops?
Yeah, I mean,
I've never been like, man, if only I had a place for this 4th SD card.
It's and that gratuitous differentiation leads to a lot of waste because you still have to power a lot of those features. Also, we're focused specifically on scale computing, and so some things that a lot of people don't think about when they have 10 or 15 computers, but if they have 10 or 15,000, they do start to think about how much material am I actually putting, physical material am I putting into my data center, because I'm going to have to decommission that someday, and why do I have to have a plastic front bezel on there? So I can put a brand on it, so it looks cool when the CEO walks through the data center. That's, the servers that we designed are a full 6 pounds lighter than a standard tier 1 OEM server. So that's 6 pounds less of material that we're going to put into the waste stream when we decommission all this stuff. And also all that plastic and other crap that sits on the front just impedes airflow, right? So you've got to spin your fans even harder to get air to come through this silly thing in the first place. So, you know, just vanity-free design is what we call it, just ripping out anything that doesn't directly attribute itself to useful work per watt per dollar just needs to get ejected from the design. Yes?
Well, actually,
Yeah.
did you, what was your?
On the governance, I mean, some of the governance issues and setting it up. What are the governance models that you see and how?
Yeah, so you know, there are a lot of different different ways that you can do governance, and everybody has a different viewpoint and opinion on it. I think that when we started this, one of the things that we really didn't know if there were a lot of people who were going to get involved or not, and so we started out, and earlier I said, you know, that we were doing 100% of the code. It was really us and the team at NASA that was responsible for all the code when we started. NASA as a government agency, there were certain things that they couldn't do to operate a project like this, and they basically asked us, you know, to take over the project management to get it launched. And so, you know, the way that we set it up initially is Rackspace kind of runs the project side of things, and then we created a technical governance model where each of the projects is able to elect a leader. We call it a project technical lead, who is kind of like the benevolent dictator for 6 months, because the elections happen every release cycle, and so, you know, the contributors are choosing their leaders from among themselves, and then there's an oversight board across all of the projects to determine what new projects come in, if there are policies that all the projects should adhere to around source repositories, release cycles, those kinds of things, and then on the other side of it, kind of the more business side with the partnerships and the marketing and community management, those kinds of things, we've had a team at Rackspace that's done that. As we move forward and kind of continue to open it up more and more, the technical side is going to stay very similar. It's been working pretty well, and you know, kind of runs itself. And the kind of softer things are what will move out of Rackspace and into a foundation that will be responsible for it. And you know, it'll be something that's completely independent and self-governing, and you know, that's going to be the long-term home for it. So you know, that's how we kind of got into it, because we ended up employing most of the developers, and you know, we're the biggest user, and we really had no idea if anybody else was going to get into it. But I think, you know, it was kind of funny, because last year in October we announced that 2012 is the year that we were going to create a foundation, and people asked us, well, why? You know, why now? Why are you doing it? And we said, well, if you look at the last 6 months, we've seen a dozen companies who've gotten really heavily involved, who are employing full-time developers, who are funding OpenStack events, who, you know, are basically stepping up and taking leadership roles, and that's exactly what we want. So let's move to a structure where everybody can participate like that.
Yeah, I would say our governance model isn't significantly different. We really based it a lot on Apache Software Foundation, where we have 6 project teams. Those project teams each have a lead, a technical lead for each project. Those project teams then report their progress into the incubation committee, and so there's a 9-person incubation committee. And those projects, both the charter and then the subsequent specifications, are voted on by the incubation committee. The incubation committee then brings it to the board of directors. There's 5 of us on the board who vote projects in or out of the foundation. We haven't voted anything out yet. We voted in 2 charters. And it's really interesting, because it's interesting to watch how my engineering team at Facebook responds to the feedback that they get from, you know, where I'm one of 5 votes. And, you know, that critical feedback is really highly motivating. It's also really highly motivating when we, you know, because we're publishing our specs, and so suppliers can go off and work on things that are inspired by those specs, and then they bring us these physical prototypes that are truly kick-ass. And my engineers are like going, wow, that's actually really good. I better up my game, right? So we're starting to see that cycle happen. So I keep bridging away from this governance model thing into the hardware stuff, just because that's where my passion is. But we're really trying to make sure that the governance model is based on the merit of the project. And then also it kind of gets tangled up with funding, which is another thing that we can talk about. And there's, in open compute, we haven't really figured it all out yet on how we're going to fund the project. We do have seed funding in place. We do believe that events are going to be probably the primary source of funding for us, so we're going to attempt to do better than break even. The Open Compute Summit summits are invite-only events. They typically are 300 to 400 people. Those 300 to 400 people are typically very large consumers of technology, so the supply base really wants access to the audience that we bring together for those summits. We may be totally naive. We may blow more cash on events than we pull in, but we're hoping that events become better than a break-even thing for us. There's also, as I mentioned, this emerging set of distributors who want to build a business around open hardware. They also don't necessarily have brands developed like a Cisco or an HP or a Dell. So they are thinking about this reseller certification process that the foundation would then audit their capabilities so that consumers of the technology would feel good about the adoption of this open source hardware. And so the transfer of the trademarks, which is really the most valuable thing that the foundation has, would probably come with some sort of fee associated with it. What we really want to avoid, though, is the ability for anybody to buy their way onto the board. We really think that that can lead to just bad juju, right, for lack of a better term. Yes?
So, can we
I'm
try to
sorry.
go in a little bit lower? Yes.
Yeah, you've been trying for a while.
I've got two questions. Both of your projects deal with large-scale computing, whereas yours is hardware using software, but both of your businesses are involve large-scale computing, so are you involved in each other's projects? That's the first question. That's an easy one. And the second question is, I assume at some point you want to see some real concrete benefits in terms of either income or cost savings. And what have you experienced to date in increased income and cost savings, or if you haven't experienced it, what do you hope to experience in the future?
Sure. You want to go first on that?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like involvement in each other's projects, I think actually Rackspace might be contributing more to Open Compute than we are to OpenStack, but I may be mistaken. But Mark Wernick, who's the COO of Rackspace, is on the board of directors of Open Compute, and also Joel Weinland, who's a hardware engineer with Rackspace, is part of a project. James Haskett is a project lead for Virtual I/O. James is with Rackspace as well. So there's definitely some Rackspace folks involved in contributing to the project. Also, Rackspace is allowing us to use their headquarters for our next Open Compute Summit on May 2nd and 3rd in San Antonio. So there's the plug for the Open Compute Summit coming up. Pretty awesome. Thank you guys. Which might help us get on our way to actually making more than we spend on events. Since we might pay the venue. Our last summit was in New York in October, and it was just awfully expensive. Tell me how it cost $30,000 to put a plastic tent on a roof because it started raining. Unions. As far as the expected benefits, I think based on the scale that we consume at, I don't really expect to see like having more consumers jump on that same design train. Probably won't lead to any sort of per unit cost declines of any sort for Facebook. The more exciting benefits, I think, to Facebook is really in that pace of innovation, right? And how if we get more of the best minds thinking about the unique problems that scale computing customers have, to the extent that that voice gets louder and the mind share around it gets more focused, I think we'll actually see better and better solutions coming out. Because scale computing, betting against scale computing is kind of like betting against the trend towards cloud computing, right? So a lot of the mind share has been around how do I design products, whether they're hardware products, data center products, software products, storage products. How do I design for the mass market, right? Because that's how as a product manager, I need to design the fewest number of products that meet the widest market need. And so to the extent that we really focus the energy and the effort and the voice around scale computing, I think all of us in the scale computing space are just going to see better solutions as a result of it.
But that's going to, better solutions means cost savings.
It should lead to cost savings, yes, but not through like direct,
Right.
Procurement costs,
Right.
right? Maybe through ongoing operating costs.
Right.
When we first launched the project, and this is in public domain, we looked at a 38% operating cost advantage relative to leasing data center space with relatively low efficient data centers. So a 38% operating cost advantage was a pretty big step function in cost trajectory, and we hope to just continue that with the work on the project.
Yeah, I think on our side there are really two aspects to it. One is micro level or whatever within our business itself, and it's some of the same things that Frank has talked about, where if we can get other brains working on this and developing it, then we can move faster. We can get features out there faster. This software powers the fastest growing part of our business, and so that's how we can directly take this and monetize it. In addition to that, we also have created a new business unit which goes and helps people implement and operate OpenStack clouds anywhere. And so we have customers who are running OpenStack in their data centers, and we actually run those clouds for them. They don't really have to do anything. They basically get kind of the ease of use of a public cloud, except for it's private and in their data center. So that's kind of within the company itself. But at a broader level, when we started to talk to some of those early companies about it back in the beginning of 2010, and we talked to some of them, we said, do you think this is a good idea? Do you think anybody would be interested? And we got a lot of encouraging feedback. They said, yes, this is something this is missing in the software space right now, and you guys bring a lot of credibility to it. When NASA joined, they obviously brought a lot of credibility to it as well. And I think part of why it's grown so quickly is people see it as a way to go after these closed proprietary options that you have out there. In the private cloud, you've got VMware, and it's proprietary, it's super expensive, it has specific configurations, and you can get locked into VMware pretty easily. And on the public side, you have Amazon. And enterprises and service providers and consumers, they look at that and they see product benefits, but they also have a lot of worry about what that means long term for their ability to have choice and their ability to have service options and cost options. And so we see it as a way, besides just furthering our feature set and providing new revenue opportunities, to also have an impact on the industry as a whole in a way that opens it up and provides more choice and more competition and kind of more leverage against some of the proprietary options out there. Yes, these are great questions, by the way.
My question is more to the forward-looking aspect, especially kind of like in hardware. Generally, the proprietary vendors or a non-disclosure type of agreement with the chip makers and all that kind of stuff. How does Open Compute handle the forward-looking aspect of the next fastest processor? For example, the AMD shift toward the GPU or open processing unit method. And again, the same question for the software stack. How do you bring in new technologies that are not presently available, and how do you go forward from there? How do you incorporate them into your community?
So I guess I'll take it from a system level first, and I'll give you an example of Sandy Bridge, which is the new technology that Intel just launched. I think where most of the cool stuff comes from is really at the system level. If you look at the Open Compute specs, it's how do I design a data center, an electrical distribution scheme, a cooling scheme, and the physical incarnation of the product, so that whatever IP I put inside of that physical boundary can be powered and cooled as efficiently as possible. So I think we're able to, because the project really owns most of the, call it the CAD design, we can be as forward-looking as we want and publish as much of that detail about where we're headed as we want to. When it comes to microarchitecture that is not the owned by the foundation, we have an imperfect balance there between open source and what's traditionally been a very closed product development cycle. I don't think in the coming year or two we're going to probably figure out how to change that, because obviously there's a lot of intellectual property that's very unique to Intel or AMD or ARM that is not going to be shared in the public domain 9 months ahead, so their competitors can get a chance to kind of try and head them off. But what we do, and it is the case with the Sandy Bridge project that we just launched, is we work really closely with Intel to provide what I'll call, I can't find a nicer way to say it, it's a diluted version of the spec. So we wrote the spec, but we obviously had to work with Intel and with their legal teams to make sure that enough of the totally proprietary stuff was pulled out so that their competitors didn't get an opportunity to view what was happening. My hope is that we will evolve that over time, but at least at the system level, when we own the specs and we own the intellectual property, we can be as open as we'd like, and that's where I think a lot of the benefits come from. And then the component level technologies that fill those mechanical specs, we're going to keep chipping away at that one. That answer your question?
Kind of, but, from your answer, you kind of lead towards the Intel in that aspect and, not so much incorporate the new developments in AMD kind of thing.
Well, we do.
Architecture type.
Our specifications are out there for the AMD G34 based system designs as well. We haven't done any projects yet based on ARM, but I truly believe that the ARM ecosystem is going to shake up the server space sooner than everybody thinks. And I'm excited about that. And I'm rooting for ARM, I'm rooting for AMD. I mean, I want to see competition in this space. I think it's good for all of us. So I used Sandy Bridge as an example because that's the most recent product launch that we did.
Yeah, on the software side, it's interesting. We've actually had to consciously slow things down a little bit because stability is the balancing side of features, and for the first year, we were putting in features as fast and furiously as we could, and it showed in the quality of some of the previous releases. But in the last 6 months, we really had a huge focus as a community on tightening things down and stabilizing the software and ramping up the level of care with all of the features that are in there. I think it's a little different because a lot of the people who are involved with OpenStack see OpenStack as the foundation for other services and software that gets built on top of it. So they're happy to make this kind of core part of it, the engine as feature rich and functional as it can be, and then they go and they build everything else around that that they differentiate on. And I think that's worked pretty well because it allows OpenStack to have some focus to it. Right now it's not trying to be platform and database and software as a service and all these other things. It's trying to be infrastructure, compute, storage, networking, and do it in a really automated and highly scalable way. I think that's one of the things that we've seen a little bit. There's another question over here. Yes?
How did you make the decision to start your own foundation versus joining one of the team hundreds of thousands that exist in infrastructure?
Yeah. Well, for us, we actually looked at, we spent a lot of time reviewing existing foundations. We've got a couple of other OpenStackers over here, Mark Collier and Lauren Sell. And Mark and I spent a ton of time pouring through all of the documents for other foundations, doing things like reading all the public board minutes, and really trying to get a feel for how they worked and how they operated. We wanted to see if there was something that would be a good fit for it. And what we came down to, there were two that seemed like pretty close, basically Apache and Eclipse. Some of the things that we felt made OpenStack successful were this combination of an independent technical process that allowed people to get involved really easily, to contribute really easily, to have opportunities to advance in leadership, but at the same time, this kind of business aspect of it where we were going out and actively encouraging companies to get involved, doing marketing and PR and everything around it. So we had actually patterned some of our development processes around Apache, but when we went and we looked at Apache, we actually talked to some of the leadership there, and Apache is really set up around helping a project operate in a way where it's about getting the software out and making sure that every voice is heard. And they actually said, we when it comes to individual projects, what we care about is the development process, and not necessarily all of the other stuff around it. And we definitely care about all of the other stuff too. And so we thought of hybrid ways of doing it. We thought of a lot of different things, but we felt like that wasn't necessarily necessarily the best fit. Eclipse includes, a technical process and then also some of the other businessy kinds of things. But some of what we heard in the community is Eclipse is very big, has lots of players, and they felt like it would get lost. And for the companies that are involved in OpenStack, a lot of times it's super core to their business. At Rackspace, it is our business, and we have startups who have launched companies and gotten funding, and their entire business is OpenStack. And we have other big companies like HP who are betting their cloud strategy on OpenStack. And so when we put all of that together, we felt like it really merited having its own organization that could focus on kind of the OpenStack way of running projects, of promoting them, and of representing the interests of the people who were really bought into it and betting on it.
I think focus is a really critical part of it, because I'm just thinking about, we've only been running in a foundation since October, but I was just trying to think of if we were part of a different foundation and we're trying to get any level of depth on any of the 6 projects that we have underway, we barely get to the level of depth that we desire to get to with the 6 projects that we have. So if we would have folded into an already existing foundation, I think the focus probably wouldn't have been there as much as we might like. It's actually one of the bits of constructive feedback that we got, just loosely related to the last Open Compute Summit, because it was a 1-day event. And everybody's like, dude, you need to make this at least a 2-day event because I want to get deeper into these projects instead of scraping the surface on all of them. I only have time to go to one session. So getting more depth and getting more focus on each of the projects to get them moving forward. And also not diluting kind of the design principles that we originally started out with, right? Because I think that's another interesting dynamic in an open source project is you want to include everybody's feedback, right? It's open by definition. But at the same time, if you spend too much time listening to legacy requirements, then you may end up with a design principle that looks a heck of a lot like what's already out there today, right? So one of the struggles that we're going through right now is saying, yes, this is all inclusive. We want to be open. We want to get your feedback. But we're not going to sway from this leading edge infrastructure that's designed specifically for scale computing, right? The other 70% of the market, we believe, is going to be coming that direction. But finding a nice way to say thank you for your feedback and we hope that you'll adopt, but we're not going to implement that feedback. It's a really, really hard thing in hardware, right? Because ultimately you have one tangible bit of infrastructure that you then give back to the community, and you can't, it's not necessarily easy to uninstall. It's not necessarily easy to patch, right? So, collecting all that feedback and having it turn into one really cool thing. I'd rather have really big smiles and really big frowns than just kind of have everybody kind of feel like, oh, that's pretty mediocre, right?
What else? Other question? Yes?
I feel like I keep running into more and more religiously open source people, and I'm kind of curious.
I've never met anyone like that.
I mean, do you think there's room for, I feel like if you're going all open source, if you don't have the staff brain power to really leverage the open source products, is there a middle ground? And do you have any advice for smaller IT staff that maybe don't have the people power to really implement open source,
yeah,
or have to integrate open source with proprietary?
Yeah, I think I've been involved in a lot of open source projects in one way or another since about 1995 or 1996, and I think that it definitely there was a religious aspect to a lot of it. And you look at some of the well-known open source leaders, and they have kind of that religious figure aura about them. But I think the reason that we wanted to open source, there were definite business reasons for it. I mean, we also felt like it was going to be a good thing for the industry, and our company had benefited from open source over the years, and this was a way to kind of give back and contribute something that we had developed. But I think that if you look at what Facebook has done, what we have done, you look at some of the other options out there in open source software. I think that there is kind of this movement of almost pragmatic open source that is more approachable and things like users and getting people into the project easily and that kind of thing. So I think it depends on what software you want to use. There are definitely really hardcore open source communities out there where it's hard to go in as a new person and ask questions and get involved. And I think that even those communities though, a lot of times they're really excited about having somebody new come and join. And so I think it's what's the skill set that you need? It's probably thick skin and perseverance and a willingness to just keep pushing and work your way in some of those kinds of communities, or try to find one of the kind of gentler ones that really looks forward to having users. I think something like Drupal. Drupal is a really open community, and their conferences are a lot of fun and very easy to go get involved in. And there are a lot of I think there are a lot of open source projects that are operated like that now. They see it not just about software development, but about building a team and a partnership with a lot of people. I don't know. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, on the hardware side, obviously, I mean, I'll start by reality check. Like, open source hardware is not going to be for everybody, right? Like, if you're not in the scale computing space, it probably doesn't make sense from a staffing perspective or financial perspective or any perspective to jump over some of the suppliers who do a great job of building mainstream hardware that's well validated and well supported. But that's why we also, when we look at our community in open compute, it's very inclusive of those same suppliers, because they're being inspired by the specs. Whether they'll rebrand it as open compute or whether the next ProLiant or the next PowerEdge server comes out looking a heck of a lot like an open compute server, doesn't matter to me, right? Like, they can use the brand or not use the brand. It's totally cool as long as the community gets the best possible hardware they can get. But I think as companies grow really quickly, like this is in public domain, Zynga just came out and actually complimented open compute for helping them think differently about the way they're scaling, because they're scaling up very, very quickly. So a lot of small companies that start this way grow exponentially, and growing efficiently, not just from a financial perspective, but from an environmental perspective, is really important to a lot of companies. And so, putting the framework together so that a consumer can get connected with an original design, right? So I can demystify this a little bit from a supply chain perspective. Everything gets designed and built by OEMs, right? Whether they have an HP label or a Dell label or no label, they get back to a consumer at some point, right? And so the amount of risk that you're willing to take, like Facebook, for example, we went directly from Facebook to an ODM, and we designed and manufactured everything and come back directly to Facebook. Then you have HP and Dell here, the jump that a lot of mainstream IT consumers leverage: HP, Dell, IBM, etc. Others are starting to jump kind of closer to the ODM, like ZT Systems and Synex, who can act more as an integrator of these open source technologies. So it's really just a matter of where you want to sit on that spectrum as to how you consume the technology. It doesn't take as many people as you might think, right? We started the Open Compute project with 3 engineers. We're now at about a dozen, and I've got about a handful of supply chain people who actually manage all of the procurement of the componentry and everything else, but it doesn't take a ton of people.
Yes.
So I'm neither a software guy or a hardware guy, but I am fascinated by the open source model. And my question is, have y'all seen the open source model used in other industries outside of the tech world?
I feel like there's some.
There's got to be some obvious example that I'm not thinking of.
There was a talk about this yesterday.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
What was the answer?
If you go to opensource.com, actually, it's an entire website devoted to telling stories about where open source is being used in business and law and stuff like that.
Yes, law. That's actually one that VC funding is kind of an area where in the last couple of years, there have been a bunch of VC documents that different law firms have collaborated on together, and they're standard documents. If you want to get funded, or some VCs only use these documents, and everybody kind of knows what's in them, and they're vetted, and everybody gets the same terms. That's
important to think about it as open innovation as opposed to open source, right? Because like even in the Open Compute project, a lot of the source files for like a motherboard design, the people who spent the brain power and dollars to do that aren't necessarily going to just go and open source that file, right? The CAD files and the other things that other contributors have provided, those are truly open source. But if you look at applying this in other areas of business where you might have really valuable intellectual property that you don't want to open source, but you can still openly collaborate and openly innovate, I think that allows it to be applied to a bunch of different parts of the world.
You're going to add something?
Laws, I think, are a really good example because even though lawyers kind of come and torture technical people with IP law, you don't see patents on contract structures. You know, you don't, in the law, people in the legal profession understand that if you could patent contract structures, the entire process of fabricating law would grind to a halt. But, you know, so they don't really answer to their own measures. You know, they don't do code the same way they do law.
Publishing, I guess, is another one where there have been a lot of Creative Commons, you know, just kind of like an open license in media and books and things.
In terms of publishers, it's usually called open content.
Yeah.
You know, some of the
Charles
open
has a
source
question.
is really giving it with the right hand and taking it with the left hand, case in point Google with Android. You know, if you use an Android, you are being tracked as a smart because of the Google licensing that they changed in mind. Unfortunately, that creates legal problems if you try to use that technology for medical reasons. You know, that you cannot use any of the Google technology if you're implementing any of the medical applications because there is a whole series of privacy laws that follow medical and you cannot track an individual. You know, so that's where, you know, the open source stick gives it with the right hand and it took it with the left hand.
I'm kind of have a hypothetical. I'm wondering about open source to address kind of obsolescence issues. My company has a number of microlithography tools, the manufacturer of which is Applied Materials, but you know, from the manufacturing point of view, the economic life of these systems is over. I mean, they still produce, you know, single digit like units every year, but the install base that's in the world now is all that it's, you know, pretty much going to be. However, on the user end, on our end, there's the economic life of these systems is still quite viable and will be for a number of years. Suppose Applied Materials decides we're getting out of servicing these things. There's software on these things that and hardware. There's like old Spark systems and whatnot, what have you. Is there a sort of an open source approach to a problem like that?
I don't know that there's one today, but I can tell you that like one of the things that was cool about starting Open Compute was that there was already passion in the community before we ever established Open Compute, right? So if you and your peers who have these lithography machines that you think still have